Welcome to Oil and Gas Law with Energy Law Prof. This lesson is about royalties. So as a reminder of our common types of oil and gas interest, we have the fee interest where you own the surface, you own to the center of the earth, you own the oil and gas under your land. We have a mineral interest where that surface owner has sold off the right to develop oil and gas on the land. And that includes the executive right, which we'll explore later, which is the right to choose how that land is developed and to lease that land to an oil and gas company. We have the leasehold interest, which is what the lessee oil and gas company has once the land has been leased to it and it's been given the exclusive right to produce oil and gas from the property, and typically the vast majority of the oil and gas from production on that land, typically a 7/8 of share of everything produced on that land. Then we have the surface interest, which is what remains after a fee owner sells the mineral interest away to another party. And then we have the royalty interest, which is what the lessor, the landowner, retains in return for leasing the exclusive right to produce oil and gas to an oil and gas company. That royalty interest, as we've talked about before, that's a share of production or the revenues from production, and it's free of production costs. Some things to keep in mind. That royalty share doesn't include the right to work the property. Of course, the landowner who's leased the land in return for that royalty doesn't have the right to choose how it's developed anymore. That was given to the oil and gas company. That's equally true if it's not the landowner that has the royalty. As we'll see, there are things called non-participating royalties where some other party might go to the landowner and say, hey, here's $1 million, give me a 1/40th share of all the oil that's produced from your land from now on. That person, just because they have a 1/40th share of production, doesn't have any right to choose how oil and gas is produced on that property. They also don't have the right to lease that property. Right? That's up to the landowner who owns it. They don't have the right to any other lease benefits. So they don't share in the bonus, the delay rentals, etc. That's for whoever signs the lease, typically the mineral interest owner. Okay. Now, the stereotypical lessor's royalty has been 1/8. It was that for generations, for decades. Nowadays, it varies and is typically larger. Now, what kinds of royalty interest can there be? Well, the one we mostly discussed and we'll mostly talk about going forward is the lessor's royalty. So that's reserved from that leasehold interest that's given to the lessee oil and gas company. The lessor, the landowner, maintains a lessor's royalty, historically 1/8, now typically larger. The oil and gas company, from its 7/8 or maybe slightly smaller interest in production, can grant an overriding royalty. Two typical ways that could happen. One is the oil and gas company could maintain the lease but say, you know what, I don't have time to drill it right now. Some other company, you come in and drill it, and you can have a 1/16th share of all the oil that we find. Another way is that first oil and gas company that leased it might say, you know what, I don't even want to have this lease anymore. I'll transfer it to another oil and gas company, but when I transfer it to them, they should give me a 1/16th share of production. So now I'm not on this lease anymore, but I continue to get a 1/16th overriding royalty that's created out of that leasehold interest. Okay, the other situation, which I previewed earlier, is a non-participating royalty. That's not participating in any lease. It's created entirely separate from any lease. And so typically what happens is a landowner might just share a portion of their production with another party in return for money. Sometimes it happens because a landowner, when he or she sells the property, doesn't want to give away an oil and gas fortune if it has no idea if there's oil and gas on the property. And so it might retain some interest in it. Maybe it wants to say, I get 1/2 of all eventual landowner royalties from this property. And so that former landowner no longer owns the property, but they have a continuing right to a share of production from that property. It's not connected with any lease, and so that would be a non-participating royalty interest. All right, what does a royalty look like? Here's an example clause, paragraph 3, as it is in the example lease that I've given you. here's what an oil royalty clause could look like. The royalties to be paid by the lessee are on oil 1/8 of that produced and saved from said land, the same to be delivered at the wells or to the credit of the lessor into the pipeline to which the wells may be connected. Now I want you to look at that for a second and decide, is this a payment of oil or is this a payment of money? Is the landowner getting a share of the oil produced or a share of the revenues from sale of that oil? This is a share of the oil directly. Now, there can be other provisions. Here's an example that say, or in the absence of a pipeline connection to the transporter receiving lessee's oil and at the same price received by the lessee. So the idea is, okay, well, if you don't have a pipeline connection, you sell it and give me the money. Now, let me ask you a question. Why would the landowner want the oil rather than just the money for the oil? Because presumably the landowner's interest in this is fundamentally monetary. Well, the basic reason is that if you get the oil directly, that keeps the oil and gas company honest. Because if they're going to give you the money from sales of the oil, then you have to make sure that the oil and gas company is getting the best rate for sales of that oil. And we'll see that's a big issue in the context of natural gas. If you get the oil directly, then you can assure yourself that you're selling for the best possible price you can find. Now, I will tell you that a lot of times there is a separate agreement between the landowner and the oil and gas company called a division order that has the oil and gas company sell the oil on behalf of the landowner and then just give the landowner the proceeds. But the basic way that an oil royalty clause is typically written has the oil and gas company just giving the oil to the landowner. All right, what does a gas royalty clause look like? Here's an example. On gas produced from said land and sold or used off the premises, the market value at the well of 1/8 of the gas so sold or used, provided that on gas sold at the wells, the royalty shall be 1/8 of the amount realized from such sale. Okay, take a look at that for a second. Same question. Is this a share of the gas that is produced, or is this a share of the money from sales of the gas? For gas, it's a share of the money. And you can see that there's actually two provisions depending on where the gas is sold. So if the gas is taken off the lease by a pipeline and sold somewhere else off the premises, then what the landowner gets is 1/8 of the market value at the well. The market value at the well if it's sold away from the well after transporting it by pipeline. Okay. By contrast, if the gas is sold at the wells, then the landowner receives 1/8 of the amount realized. Okay, what is the amount realized? The amount realized is how much the natural gas company got for selling all of its natural gas, right? It actually produced 8/8 out of the ground. It gets to keep the value of 7/8 of that, but 1/8 of the value goes to the landowner. So when it gets $800, $700 for itself from the sale, $100 to the landowners. That amount realized means the same thing. Sometimes you'll see the word proceeds, the proceeds from the oil and gas company's sale of the natural gas. And the basic reason that natural gas is treated differently than oil is that oil, the landowner practically could store and could potentially find a buyer for. Natural gas, of course, because it's a gas, harder to store. Realistically, the landowner needs the lessee to make that sale for him or her. And so the landowner doesn't want the gas itself, just wants the money from the gas. Final thing I want you to look at. Think about this contrast between the amount realized, the proceeds from sale for gas that's sold at the well, and the market value of at the well of gas when it is not sold at the well, when it's sold off the premises. Let's think about why that might be, some of the complications that it will create, and we'll see those in a second. But for now, I want you to think about a hypothetical problem under this kind of lease. And this is the problem that arises when you have negative natural gas prices. Just a couple years ago, we had negative natural gas prices. Negative natural gas prices are likely to be more common in the future. Why would gas ever have a negative price? I mean, if you have to pay somebody to take the natural gas away from you, wouldn't you just burn it off? You know, a spark is free. Why not just flare or burn off that natural gas? The basic reason is that there are regulations that prevent you from doing that, because when you just burn off the natural gas, there are carbon emissions, so that contributes to climate change. Some might consider it a waste, given that natural gas in certain times and places is very expensive, so they might not want you to flare off that natural gas. And so because there are limits, sometimes oil and gas companies are willing or have to pay other companies to take that natural gas away. So now I want you to think about what happens in that circumstance, because imagine that you have a lease clause that says the royalties to be paid on gas by the lessee are 1/8 of the amount realized, the proceeds, what the lessee gets, computed at the mouth of the well. Okay, now imagine that that gas at the well was worth minus $1,800. So effectively, for the month, the oil and gas company had to pay minus $800 to take away all of its gas. Now I want to ask you a question. So the amount realized was minus $800. The landowner's share of that would be minus $100. Could the oil and gas company simply send the landowner a bill for minus $100? Landowner, you are supposed to get 1/8 of the amount realized. The amount realized was minus $800. So now you owe me a check for $100. If any of you have heard of an example of that happening, I'd love to know about it. I certainly haven't heard of it. The whole idea of the relationship between the oil and gas company and the landowner is that the landowner never has to pay anything. They only get money. They get a bonus, and then they get a share of those royalties going forward. So it's a one-way flow of money from the landowner to the oil and gas company. If the landowner wanted to pay money, hey, they could be an equity holder. They could be helping to finance the well itself and making a lot more money. So the landowner typically wants no risk of ever having to pay anything. They just want a one-way flow of money. So I haven't heard of anyone doing that. You might wonder whether under the terms of this lease, the literal terms, that would be allowed. Interesting question. Okay. So if oil and gas companies don't do that, let me ask you if they could do two other things. One is these wells that have natural gas typically have some oil as well. In fact, typically you would just shut that well in if it was having negative gas, negative royalty from gas, and it was only producing gas. You might shut it in and wait for higher prices. Now, what I wonder about is, okay, so if this is an oil well, you don't want to shut it in, it's producing some oil, the oil has a positive royalty. What would you do if let's say it's only minus 400, and so the amount of 1/8 would just be minus 50 for the month. You don't want to send the landowner a bill, but you say, you know what, landowner, technically you owe me $50. I'm not going to send you a bill, but if the next year or next month the amount realized turns positive and I owe you $100, instead of sending you $100, I'm just going to send you $50 because you really owe me $50. So can the lessee carry that loss forward to offset future months' royalty? Consider what you think about that one. All right, if that still bothers you, what about this? Can the lessee offset that gas price against the oil royalty? So let's imagine that the oil royalty is significant. So the landowner is owed $200 in oil royalty. But the gas royalty would be minus 100. Can the oil and gas company offset those two numbers and say, I would have owed you $200 just for the oil, but it's really a negative amount realized for natural gas. And so I get to offset those amounts and only pay you $100. If you think that would be reasonable for the oil and gas company to do, how is that different from simply sending them a bill? Isn't that violating the same principle that the royalty, whether the oil royalty or the gas royalty, is never designed to have the lessor, landowner, paying the lessee? So let's think about these have been big issues for oil and gas companies over the last few years and are likely to be bigger in the future because what we're seeing is a lot more restrictions on flaring natural gas because people are growing more and more concerned about the carbon impact of that. And the more that we restrict flaring natural gas, the more we're going to see negative natural gas prices at times where there's situations where the oil and gas company can't flare the natural gas and so it has to pay somebody to take it away. How are landowners and oil and gas companies going to navigate that? All right, now let's talk about a case about what it means to sell something for market value. This is a case from Texas 2001. It's on page 309 in your 8th edition text. So this is a case where the oil and gas company made a good long-term sale of natural gas. So it made a long-term deal with somebody that wanted natural gas to sell natural gas for years at $8 an MCF. MCF is a common unit for natural gas sales. The two most common units that you'll see for natural gas sales are an MCF, which means 1,000 cubic feet, and an MMBTU, which stands for a million British thermal units. Now, the nice thing is that those are roughly equivalent. 1 MCF is roughly equivalent to 1 MMBTU, even though MMBTU is a unit of energy and MCF is a unit of volume. But if you're looking at those measures and you say, okay, $10 an MCF seems expensive, well then $10 an MMBTU, same thing, also expensive. All right, so what happened in this case? The oil and gas company made a good deal, and under this good deal, it was receiving $8 per an MCF for all the natural gas it produced. But the landowner was only receiving $2 an MCF, and that's because the lease gas royalty said that for gas sold off the premises, and this was gas sold off the premises, then the landowner would just receive market value. And the oil and gas company said, look, this is sold off the premises. We made a great deal to sell this natural gas at $8 an MCF. So we're getting $8 an MCF for all of this gas. But since then, the price has fallen and the market value of gas is now $2 an MCF. And so since we owe you the market value for gas sold off the premises, you just get $2 an MCF. The court agrees with the oil and gas company. It says, look, sold off the premises, so the landowner just gets the market value, it's that lower amount, $2. Now, this case really follows from an earlier case, a Texas case from 1968, the Vela case, and in that case, it went the other way. The oil and gas company had made what turned out to be a bad deal, and it had committed to sell gas at a very low rate for a long time, and so when the landowner said, I don't want to be paid at that low rate that you're getting for the gas you're selling from my land, I want to be paid at the current market rate. And the court said, well, your lease says that you're supposed to get the market value, and the market value is now higher, and so the landowner should receive that higher amount. So from these two cases, you see that when the lease specifies that the amount to be paid to the landowner is market value, that is not the amount that it's sold at under the long-term lease. That's what the current market value of the natural gas would be. Now, what I want you to know is not every state comes to that conclusion. So there's been litigation about this in a bunch of states. What's the market value of gas if the lease specifies that the landowner should receive 1/8 of market value? The majority of states follow that Texas rule. So you see that in Kansas, Montana, North Dakota, West Virginia. And that says, look, market value means what it's worth now. And so even if it's sold under a long-term contract, so the oil and gas company is receiving a lot more because it made a good deal, or a lot less because it made a bad deal, as in Vela, the landowner should still receive the current market value. Now, the minority rule, which is in a case called Terra, which is from Oklahoma, 1981, says, look, market value doesn't necessarily mean the instantaneous market value. If you made a deal to sell gas for 10 years at $8 an MCF, then the market value was, for those 10 years, $8 an MCF. You sold it in a free market, that's the market value. And so the landowner should receive the same amount that the oil and gas company did. So there's not much of a difference between an amount realized or proceeds lease, which gives the landowner a share of the amount realized or proceeds, or how much the oil and gas company got, and the market value lease, which is according to Oklahoma, just based on the same transaction. What did the oil and gas company got? So Oklahoma doesn't see a big difference between those two terms. Texas, Kansas, North Dakota, West Virginia, all see a very big difference between those terms. Amount realized or proceeds is what the oil and gas company sold it for. Market value is what it was worth at the time that it was produced. So think about that. What it was worth at the time it was produced. That can actually be hard to determine. It's easy to determine if it was not sold under a long-term contract, but just sold day by day. Well, then, whatever it was sold at, that's what it was worth. But if it's sold under a long-term contract, there could be a big difference between what it was agreed to be sold at 8 years ago and what the current market rate is. And so if you want to know what the current market rate is, then you have to look at comparable sales. And that can be very hard to say what kind of sale is comparable. Of course, you want to probably compare it to sales from nearby wells, but some of those nearby wells might also be under long-term contracts. So you're going to have to find some nearby wells where there's short-term sales that might reflect the current market value. And when you think about whether that's really a comparable sale, you have to think about, well, was it a sale that was, at the right time, and was it very close to the period of time that I'm trying to value this natural gas for? Was it the same quality? Did it have more or less sulfur in it? Because we know that having those kind of impurities can make the gas worth less. Is it the same quantity? Sometimes if you sell more natural gas, you get a bonus for that because you're satisfying the entire need of a company for natural gas. Sometimes you actually get paid less for it because basically somebody says, look, I'll take it all off your hands for a 20% discount. Even if those wells are pretty nearby, there may be some differences in their pipeline connections, and so how good access they have to the most, the closest market. All right. When you find some prices for the market value, if those prices aren't at the well, remember that the typical lease says you get the market value at the well. And so maybe there are some sales you try to compare it to, but those are sales at the end of a pipeline where the gas has been brought from the well, transported, compressed, processed, had the sulfur removed. And so to figure out what that gas was worth at the well, you might have to subtract some of the costs that were spent to improve it to bring it to that point where it was finally sold. This is a very important point to understand as we look about some of the disputes that happen over natural gas pricing. And to do that, I think it's helpful to take a look at this picture. So when we talk about the oil and gas industry, a common way of talking about it is talking about moving from upstream, the wells where the oil and gas is produced, to downstream, the users that use that oil and gas. So you could just imagine that oil originating at wells up in the mountains and flowing downhill to those consumers in the valley below. And so when you talk about something in that supply chain of oil and gas, you talk about, is it more upstream towards the producers of that oil and gas, or is it more downstream where that oil and gas gets refined, processed, and sold to consumers? So when you think about oil and gas moving from upstream to downstream, you can think about how sometimes we need to subtract certain costs to figure out what the value of the natural gas was further upstream. So let's look at this picture. Now you have oil and gas that comes out of the well and is gathered together, water is removed, it's then transported to a processing facility where maybe some of the sulfur is removed, and then it's transported again to an end user that finally burns that natural gas. Now each of those steps cost money, and so let's imagine that the natural gas is finally sold here. So at the end of being transported, gathered, had the water removed, it's processed, it might have been compressed for entering this pipeline, so it's sold right at this point. And right at this point, its value is $3 per MMBTU, per million British thermal units. Now, let's imagine that the oil and gas company spent $1 per MMBTU of gas to gather, transport, and process that gas. So then the oil and gas company could say, well, really what it was worth at the well was $2 an MMBTU. And then I spent $1 per MMBTU to improve it by gathering, transporting to market, and so it's sold for $3 per MMBTU. Now note that in theory, this is actually great for both parties, both for the landowner and for the oil and gas company. And that's because imagine that we were really sure it does cost $1 per MMBTU to gather, transport, and process this gas. And we can observe that it's sold for $3 an MMBTU. How much could it likely have sold for at the well? Well, probably less than $2, because the oil and gas company wouldn't spend this money transporting its own gas, because remember, it gets to keep 7/8 of the gas. It wouldn't have spent all this money transporting and processing it to just sell it for $3 unless it was worth substantially less than $2 at the well. It would only undertake all these expensive steps if it was getting more than its money worth for doing so. And so for the landowner, when they only get the market value at the well, yeah, it's less than $3. But presumably, if the oil and gas company didn't take all those steps, it would have been worth even less at the well, maybe $1.50, maybe only 50 cents an MMBTU. And so in theory, this should benefit both parties. In practice, what we'll see, the big challenge is that these numbers here about it costs exactly $1 per MMBTU to gather, transport, and process the gas aren't really that transparent. And so there can be big fights about whether it really cost the oil and gas company that much. Because, of course, the oil and gas company would like to pay less royalty. And so they might have an incentive to exaggerate what those costs are to gather, transport, and process the gas. Particularly if the oil and gas company was actually the one taking those steps. So it's a lot easier to calculate if the oil and gas company paid another company to process the gas, paid another company to transport the gas, and it was an unrelated company. But what if it's an affiliated company where maybe the oil and gas company would love to overpay them because that's more profits for its affiliated company? Or what if it's processed at a plant that's built by the same oil and gas company? And so they say, well, it works out to $1 an MMBTU because we take the full cost of this plant and we average it over all the gas it's going to transport over the next 10 years. Do you trust that calculation as a landowner? So in theory, this provides benefits to both the landowner and the oil and gas company by taking steps that more than pay off in terms of improving the price that you can receive for the natural gas. But in practice, there can be big disputes about the calculations involved and how they might reduce what the lessor, landowner, is paid. Okay, we're going to talk more about that in future lessons. Let me identify another kind of dispute that we can have about royalties. So remember that you, as the landowner, get 1/8 of the amount realized or the market value at the well, basically the amount of money that the oil and gas company got for the natural gas it sold. But sometimes it's difficult to say exactly how much money the oil and gas company got for the gas it sold, because a lot of times when an oil and gas company sells natural gas, it receives a bunch of different payments, and they're not always just a simple payment for the gas. So let me give you an example of that. A very common example, this is just one example, and I think it's useful for you to think about because this is a common contract that we see in the oil and gas industry, and that's take-or-pay payments. A take-or-pay contract, very common in situations where somebody has to invest in building long-term infrastructure to provide you with a product. And they don't want to do that unless they can be sure that you're going to keep paying them for years to come, months to come, years to come. And so historically, pipelines often agreed to buy natural gas from companies that agreed to produce natural gas. And they said, look, to give you assurance to go ahead and make the long-term investments in drilling for oil and gas, we are going to promise you that we are going to pay you for natural gas every month, or else if we can't take the natural gas because we have no use for it that month, we'll just pay you anyway. So these take-or-pay contracts are really kind of like a pay-or-pay contract, right? They say, we are going to either take the natural gas and pay for it or just pay you for the gas. Now, what I want you to think about is if the buyer doesn't take natural gas and just makes a payment to the oil and gas company, is that an amount realized in return for the sales of gas? Or is that just some other payment to the oil and gas company? Because if it's amount realized for gas, it has to be shared with the royalty landowner. But if it's just another payment to the oil and gas company, then it doesn't need to be shared. It's an interesting question. Now, normally, that doesn't come up very often because in the normal course of business, the buyer is going to get a right to take more natural gas in future months if it paid for it but didn't take it in a particular month. And so usually it all evens out over time, and so the buyer is eventually going to get gas, and so it will have paid for that. That royalty will be shared with the landowner. But in the 1980s, there was a recession, and so a lot of pipelines had to permanently default on these take-or-pay contracts. And so instead of saying, oh, I will pay you this month, but I'll pick it up next month, they just said, hey, I guess in theory I would have to pay you for years to come, but I just can't take this gas, and so I'm not giving it to you. Now, the pipeline said that was all okay under force majeure, and they shouldn't have to make those take-or-pay payments, but they pretty much lost all those cases. And so instead what happened is they were sued by the gas sellers, and the gas sellers said, hey, look, you got to make me that whole stream of payments if you're not going to take the gas moving forward. Now, the problem that the gas sellers ran into is those pipelines were on the verge of bankruptcy. And so they said, look, you can sue us, but you're never going to get most of this money anyway. And so typically what happened is those disputes were simply settled for pennies on the dollar. So the gas sellers said, okay, we'll just take a little bit of money for that. Now, what I want you to think about is, in the same way that you could question, is that payment under a take-or-pay contract, does that count as amount realized? What about this settlement, which is basically, okay, this contract is over. Does that count as a payment? Is that amount realized that has to be shared with the lessors? The royalty owners said, look, this is basically another way of paying us for the natural gas under a long-term contract, and that should be shared with us. Now, the United States, the federal government, Texas, and Oklahoma disagreed with that. They said, look, royalty is due when gas is produced. If this gas is not produced, and this is just a payment for breaking this contract, then that money doesn't need to be shared with the landowner. Louisiana and Arkansas, however, said, no, this is all part of a collaborative venture between the lessor and the lessee. And so the lessee was basically, bargaining for some kind of assurance payments for the gas from the lessor. And so as a result, that should be shared with the lessor as well. Okay, the same question about sort of different payments that are made to natural gas companies when they make an agreement to sell natural gas to a different party. Should those be shared with the landowner, with the lessor? Here's a couple examples that have arisen from time to time. One is a demand charge. So in addition to the payment per MMBTU of gas. Obviously, that has to be shared with the landowner. What if there's like a bonus that if a company takes a lot of gas at a particular time, that's harder for the oil and gas company to serve, and so they should pay an extra demand charge? Should that be shared with the landowner as well? What about if at the time that the contract is formed, there's a signing bonus that is paid to the oil and gas company in return for agreeing to provide all this gas? Does that need to be shared with all the landowners who supported that deal? Or think about just the continuing relationships between these natural gas companies and the oil and gas consumers that they supply. What if those oil and gas consumers are treating the natural gas company very well, bringing them to sporting events, giving them all sorts of perks? Do all of those need to be calculated in terms of their value and shared with each landowner at a 1/8 share? So these are some of the kinds of disputes that can arise, and in our next lesson we're going to see some of the other very complex disputes that can arise in pricing a natural gas royalty.